Well, good evening. It's a beautiful Sunday afternoon in February in Sydney. Summertime, beautiful little breeze out through my window, sunlight kind of streaming in just behind you, Arvo evening sun. So it's just a beautiful time of year, beautiful day. Perfect time to wrap up, what I want to talk about today, which is this book, Berlin's Hollow Homes by Trevor Carroll. Maybe not something a book you would have heard of. Just finished reading it, and this is very special because it's written by my neighbour. So by chance, my neighbour is also an author, a self-published author, and I had been meaning to read this for quite a while. I think I missed his launch because of COVID, but I really love this. I don't have any particular, obviously, so firstly the book is about, I'm just going to talk a bit about it today, give a bit of a wrap, summary, takeaways, discussion points, because I think it's a remarkable piece of work. So Trevor, if you're watching, well done. And I wanted to just kind of capture something about it. Basically, the gist of the book is that Trevor, who's obviously Aussie like me, and unless I'm mistaken, neither of us have any direct links to, family to that part of the world or the time of the Holocaust in Europe, Nazism, Hitler. His son was living in Berlin, and so on his trips to Berlin with his wife, Trevor would come across the little memorials, and that's what's depicted on the cover there, called Stolperstein. I believe I've said that correctly, which were little memorials to, I believe, mainly Jews who lived in these homes in Berlin, and obviously had their lives cruelly taken from them during the Holocaust and related kind of Nazi regime activities. And Trevor kind of fell down the rabbit hole of exploring the stories behind the people remembered on these Stolperstein. So they're just tiny little, on the floor, I think, tiny little tiles, metal tiles, and there's a website, I think, that explains them, and they're the largest decentralized memorial in the world. Trevor kind of unpacks this in a lot better detail than I will, but yeah, there's thousands of them spread out all over, I think not just Berlin, but maybe Europe as well, but obviously he focused on Berlin. And so the premise of the book is basically interwoven through several trips he took to Berlin, stumbling across and looking for more and more Stolperstein, and then doing research about the stories behind these people and bringing many of them together in this book. Now, I particularly love this, obviously, knowing Trevor personally. I don't know if that's a bias because he's a good mate, but just as a work on this topic, obviously there's been so much, as there should be, literature, film, documentaries, and I've seen my fair share over the years, from documentaries to Hollywood films and other books written by concentration camp survivors. But to be honest, this hit home for me more than anything else I've encountered to date on the subject. It was one of the most emotionally, I think I have a pretty good temperament for hard to digest stuff, like emotionally dense stuff and dark things. I feel like I normally have a pretty good threshold. But I did find myself, when I'd read this often at night, kind of summoning up the gall to open it up again and, be confronted by more of the stories. And I think that what it is, because obviously you got something so big, where millions of people are killed and many more affected. And so to convey a tragedy of that scope in a piece of work like this, you normally have two main options, I think. You kind of overview, like macro, like you talk about the sheer numbers and the operation and how it worked, obviously. Like a big overlooking kind of recap. Or, obviously, you can go into individual stories, and we see a lot of both. And there's still, to this day, films being made about, obviously, incredible stories of bravery, tragedy that come out of the Holocaust period in Nazi Germany. But I guess what I thought was wonderful about this is that it's like, and what I wrote in my online review, is that you're kind of stumbling with Trevor as he goes down, because the rough structure of the book is that each chapter focuses on a different kind of street or house with the set of Stolperstein, these little plaques commemorating the previous occupants of those homes. So, you know, he's stumbling across all these stories, literally. Like, there's a tragic story, there's a tragic story, there's a tragic story. So it's just like wave after wave after wave. And obviously, you can't go into them all, it's only that thick. But he goes into particular stories. So I think that's one thing that was really special and different about this, because it helped to give you a sense of the scope and depth of that experience and the stories. But I think the other thing was that, the other thing I wanted to say on that was, it's just temporarily left me. I think the other thing was he did a good job of, when he goes into these stories, looking at the onset of the Nazi regime, the Gestapo, the SS, and with obviously a particular focus on Jews, the slow degradation and unseating of them, the slow removal of their rights, the gradual build-up from being elected to the 1935 Nuremberg laws, and then just capturing the perspective of the people at the time as this was unfolding fresh. Obviously seeing a pattern and being given some clues about where it was heading, but having no idea, and maybe not even being able to imagine how horrific that final destination or final solution was. And so when you're hearing the stories about people debating about whether they should leave or not, or how they leave, and as he explained it to me when we were talking, Trevor, you know, pointed to my house. He goes, imagine you're here living with your family, and then all of a sudden someone comes and starts taking 10% of everything you own. And then slowly you're not allowed to work. You have a business, you know, and then they slowly just taking more and more of your possessions, your income, slowly forbidding you to work. You know, put that way, it just hits home so much more for me, rather than obviously hearing about something so tragic as a summary of millions of lives lost. It's just hard to open up it's just hard for the empathy wall to kind of open, because we all have a defense mechanism, I think, against horrors of this magnitude. So, you know, you see all these stories about people who are slowly, it's dawning on them, and many of them couldn't leave, many of them tried to leave, many of them didn't know where to go. And as it slowly became clear that they were being taken away to concentration camps, what many of them did, whether they tried to take their own lives, or, you know, or whether they just prepared to meet their fate. And just talking about the terror of it, about the randomness of knowing you're going to be called, seeing your neighborhood slowly, all the Jews being taken. But obviously in there's so many stories of bravery too. And obviously all the things we know about the Holocaust already, with these stories like Gentiles so non-Jewish people who took the risk of hiding people, or the U-boats, which is the people who went underground and didn't answer the call to be taken away, who tried to hide. And you're just going through all these, it was just like a beautiful balance of looking at how many different people are affected by this, but then going into some of the things that happened to them and their personal stories, and it just makes it so real. The whole time I was reading it, I think naturally I use the reference point of trying to imagine something like that happening now, and how inconceivable that is, to try and imagine what that would be like, and how powerless and innocent and needless this all was, but just how warped it all was as well. You know, that powerlessness, that you could just be one day living your life, doing nothing wrong, contributing to society in your little way, and then all of a sudden this group comes, or this kind of dawns slowly, but eventually people start coming to persecute you, you know, everything from Kristallnacht. So it's all documented in here, and, you know, obviously I'm not going to recap all the little details, just the overview of how it was formatted was well done, and I thought just very powerful. And I guess reading it, because you can't do anything about this happening, but you wish you could do something to have made it not happen. I felt like the only thing you could really do is just honor or take the time to learn these stories, because that's all you can really do. Just acknowledge these people's experience, and that they were victims. And I guess that's what the little memorials, the Stolperstein, do. But also, I think that's what, because I think obviously what the attempt made under Nazism was to, not just to Jews, but all the people they picked on, targeted, was to dehumanize them, which was slowly what they did. Removal of rights, but then also obviously, reducing them to numbers. So it's always about dehumanizing people when you want to do this stuff. But yeah, this method of storytelling that can't unwrite that chapter of history brings the humanity back. And obviously it's not all doom and gloom. As with any difficult time, there's challenges, and people are given the opportunity to rise to challenges, and that's the bravery of people who didn't have to put their necks out, but tried to help, and did help at great personal risk. Stories of resilience, parents and things fighting for the survival of their children to get them out of the country. And a lot of them, obviously, especially the children, were migrated out of Germany at this time, Jewish children, to places like England and other places around Europe. A lot of people went to America. And what's fascinating about the stories in here, about how many, especially young men who went to America or places like that and then got involved in the army and then were sent back to Germany and worked as like interpreters and stuff like that. And then just the confusion of encountering other Allied soldiers, but being suspected of being Nazis and having to explain that, but also the great risks about if they were captured by the Nazis, noticing that there was a German Jew, a native German Jew in the ranks. And there are some stories about people who did go back into the army with the Americans or the British and get caught, and what happened to them. But also plenty of people who stood up to protect them. So I thought that's pretty incredible. What else did I have? And it was also interesting just because there were some stories about, stories I didn't know, heroic stories. A lot of them, you could Google them and find out more about them. But groups like the Rote Kapelle, I thought it was very fascinating learning about them, a kind of resistance group that sneakily went around, attacking or putting up anti-propaganda and removing notices and doing all this stuff. Incredible stories about people who came back to Germany after the war and then were looking for family members and things like that. So there's some really great stories in there, because the whole way you're obviously wondering what's going to happen to them or what's happened to their families. It just dawns on you reading it, just how insane it is, and how many transports have, 1,000 people are taken to somewhere like Auschwitz or one of these other camps, Theresienstadt or wherever they were, all over Europe. And Trevor, is always recounting them. 1,000 were on this train and like 5 survived the war. Or, this one had 500 and only 3 were alive at the end of the war. Like, just the number of the percentage of survivors. Obviously, once the final solution kicked in the early 1940s, is just kind of ridiculous and insane. And but yeah, there's just some moments in there that just really hit you. Moments where, father waves to his wife and 3-year-old son, and then being separated in the camp. That's the last time he ever sees them. He survives the war and they don't. But astoundingly, a lot of the resilience people had because it wasn't, obviously you get a bit of a dive here into how much people knew about, say, like the concentration camps and the extermination at the time, and whether it was suspected, what they were told instead of the truth, the stories the Jews were told, that is. So it's interesting putting yourself in their shoes, thinking about what they think is going to happen when they're, for example, loaded on a train. They think they're just going to be put in this brutal labour camp. And then after being on this train, with only one bucket to share, and it's overflowing, so it spills out onto the floor, and there's old people and everyone's just crammed in, and you're standing for 12 hours in the freezing cold, stripped down. And then you're put in a group when you finally arrive after 12 hours, a day's of travel, and you go straight into a shower and you think it's a shower. So there's all those stories, but obviously some of the ones he tells are just really uplifting and incredible. There was one, I don't want to spoil it or go too far into it, but there was one about, a man who spotted a woman about to take her life. I think she'd been called up to report to the Gestapo or someone and for deportation. And he saw her like going to jump off a bridge, and he went and, talked her down basically. And then they ended up, marrying after the war. So it was a famous story, not just for that part, but for how many other people he helped. That guy, fantastic, very like uplifting. The resilience these people had, and even the ones who were resisting or not actively resisting, but knowing their fate came to accept it or accept the risks of defiance, and how they kind of, walked to their end once caught or summoned with their heads held high. And I had a few, just let me check here. Yeah, so some of them, and this is what I mean about how real this is and why it's such a great book, I think. Just because a lot of the really personal, real things were in here. Letters from, people to their family members. Just make sure I got the right page. Yes, this is one, I think this was a Rote Kapelle, which was one of the resistance groups. And this is her, writing to her family, like to her siblings. Be brave in life and don't always let yourself be pushed. So this is after she's been captured. Don't let yourself be pushed aside. Too bad that I'm not going to see your careers, but I will be careful from above to try and help you. For weeks I'd been looking forward to the process, not because of the process, which did not affect me further, but because I hoped to speak to Helmut again. And actually it worked. Someone else who got captured with her, I think. Only I had expected a different outcome for him. Helmut, who was not as excited as I was happy as ever, and that was a great relief for me. I very much regret that I was never given permission to speak and see each other once more. But we will all see each other again. And believe me, Gerd and Erslchen, I hope I said that right, I'm absolutely not afraid of death, and certainly not of divine justice, because we do not need to fear it. Remain true to your principles and stick together forever. And yes, this is someone who got caught, Maria, who refused to show any fear to the Gestapo. Maybe she didn't feel it or she put on a brave face, but she never showed any kind of intimidation. And sorry if this camera's getting dark, but almost wrapped up here. And I think it was her again. I earmarked another passage, and I think this one's her writing to her parents. So like the last letter she ever sent her parents. Or this is Krishna, sorry. Beloved parents, how hard it is to write this last letter. But you must believe me, I'm not afraid of death. I do not regret my life. I only think how much sorrow I give you, how you will grieve during the last hours of my life. I want to thank you again for your care and your love, for your unconditional dedication, my dearest mummy. I can never thank you enough for everything you have done for me, for my joyful, carefree childhood. Don't cry. Mummy, may God ease your pain. I know that you long ago forgave me all the trouble and worry I caused you. I am looking for words that would help me cheer you, but I can only think of one sentence that Pani Wanda said when she lost Lolek. God's best loved die young. I'm completely at peace, believe me, and I will remain serene to the end. My last obligation to Poland and to you is to die bravely. Beloved Daddy, dearest Mummy, I feel you are with me today, and I am so conscious of my great love for you. I dedicate my last thoughts to you. Be brave. Bid me farewell. Your Tina. And this letter was actually passed on by someone I think who shared a cell with Krishna called Hedwig, which just reminds me of Harry Potter, but that's not the point. And she wrote a letter of thanks to her, and I think they might have. So it's just like heavy, sad, tragic, pointless death, but also people finding the most incredible strength. And Trevor's just got himself out of the way and just documented as much of it as he could in an organic and engaging way. So good on my neighbour, who's also written 2 other books. They're both available at Tricky Press, I'll put links, but www.trickypress.com.au. He's got The Cops. That's about his experience working for the cops. Crossing Continents with Top Deck. I've got all these books because he also worked as a Top Deck driver. He's had quite a life. And obviously Berlin's Hollow Homes. And I think we'll get him on and we can have a bit of an interview because he put a shit ton of work and research into this. So very admirable from good old Trev. So it'll be good to have him on and talk about it. But I wanted to do this as a separate. And my last point on this book, and thanks for following along this far if you did this video or this episode. But I think one thing that was my personal kind of life at this time while reading it, the last couple of weeks, and things I've been thinking about. Just a reflection, I guess. Like, there's always been this idea. I remember this more when I was younger. I think it's a common idea in maybe the Christian upbringing I had, that there are always people worse off than you. And so it's about, which is normally a good reminder in one sense, for to appreciate what you have, to put your problems in perspective, right, and be grateful instead of down or upset or And so the irony, I always think about times like any time of war, genocide, or extreme discrimination against a group, which is the theme of this. I always try to reconcile in my head, how is it that we, in peacetime, when we're not being persecuted like this, say someone like me, who's never really experienced anything remotely close to that, how is it that we have any problems ever? Because whatever goes wrong, loss of job, high cost of living, I don't know, mental health, okay, which is a bit more sensitive topic, of course, but how do we ever really have anything to complain about for the most part? Things go wrong, but just in the grand scheme of things, how do we let problems get us down and weigh us down when there are people, done nothing wrong, persecuted, and ready to face their death, knowing their death is coming, being ready to face it, and even doing it bravely. And I guess for me, and I hope I articulate this in a good enough way, it's just a symbol. Like, for example, I don't think that it's necessarily a helpful or good way to find gratitude and appreciation, or to kind of transcend our issues if we have any. It's obviously okay to have issues, even if we're not, under a Nazi regime. It's okay to have things go wrong. It's just the human experience. But I don't think relying on that comparison is a very permanent way of overcoming that. I don't think that lasts, because I think it's purely just comparing, and all comparison is really just a sideways glance and not a permanent reorientation or change in situation to me. But what really dawned on me with this is that I'm reading this story about how crazy that is, and it just symbolized for me how even though it's okay to have, say, other issues and problems when you're not living under such a terrible time as this, it's just a perspective about what the root of those problems really is. And that at the end of the day, the root of those problems, I hope I haven't confused, maybe this is just confusing, but the root of those problems, I think, is perspective. And that might be one, not reason such tragedies happen, but that might be one of the very small, doesn't make up for upshots of it, is that it symbolizes that, in theory, if we are not facing a situation like this, we shouldn't really spend much time, no matter what happens, really, for the most part, feeling down. And the fact that it's so easy, and so many of us will and do, and can't stop it to some extent, feel down so much, I think just says so much about maybe the psychological part about our lives. and not the trap we fall into, but I think a better word is just the pattern we fall into of being focused on an everyday life. Because I think the reality is, if a situation like this were ever to be a remote possibility in our lives, and hopefully COVID is the closest thing we'll ever experience to that in my lifetime, if you think about how many things we worry about or might worry about on a daily basis or get upset about on a daily basis, you think about how many of them would just drop away immediately and cease to be concerns. You know, measuring where you're at, career stuff, what people are saying about you, being scared to try something, you know, wanting to change something. I don't know. I think it's just fascinating how a lot of those qualms would just move aside pretty much immediately if the stakes were ever to be raised in a way like this again, in a way that hits home. Not to hear about it happening somewhere else in the world so that it feels alien to you anyway, but to actually be a reality that feels like you're facing. Because what I notice is that we have things like this, right? We have major health scares, we have things like that. You know, we have things go wrong while we're traveling or we get stuck somewhere, I don't know. And we can pin the problems we normally have, but we're very elastic in that we love to come back to them. So I just think it's very interesting that what that says about it is such a symbol for where our perspective sits when we're not facing any other threats, what our minds get caught up with, and how really, if this isn't happening to us, it doesn't make sense. Like, I feel like almost like, not that we owe it to people who've been victims like this, not because it's not about trying to take on some sort of burden or anything, or linking in that way. But I just think it's like, are we crazy? Are we crazy? What are we getting worked up about? Literally everything is just a bonus. Anyway, that's just what I was thinking when I was reading it. Because it's like, it just shocks you out of that bullshit, basically. And all that stuff is bullshit that we could get worried about, I think. Because it sounds like almost as horrible as it gets. So that's what I think is powerful about, not that it needs to be said by someone like me, I'm not a big history person or anything, but it should be obvious what the value is in exploring things like this. So even though, sure, there are other books on this subject, I've found this one unique to me. So I highly recommend this one, but obviously it's a good reminder of all of us what the value is, and every so often looking into the stories of people who in the past or now might be facing such extreme hatred and seeing the strength of their response. So well done, Trevor. Obviously this was a bit of a deep, intense episode, so hope everyone was okay with that, but there might be more levity in the next one, whatever that is. But yeah, until then, trickypress.com.au, Berlin's Hollow Homes. Make sure you check it out.